Awesome. Welcome. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to turn it over immediately to our interpreter to give us instructions on how to utilize our interpretation. Claudia?
Thank you, Whitney. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all. We're going to begin interpretation in a second. And when that does, you will see a globe icon appear at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You will click on that and choose the channel of your choice. If you're on a tablet or on a cell phone, you will find out on the three dots on the top of your screen, or usually the top left corner of your screen. I will give now the same instructions in Spanish. Muy buenas tardes, un placer y un honor estar con todos ustedes esta tarde. Vamos a comenzar con la interpretación en un segundo. Cuando esta comience, usted va a ver un icono de un mundo o un globito en la parte de abajo de la pantalla de Zoom. Le va a hacer clic ahí y escoger el canal de su preferencia. Si es una tableta o en un celular, usted lo encuentra en los 3 puntos en la parte de izquierda de arriba de la pantalla. Thank you, Whitney.
Thank you, Claudia. I'll turn it over to Lily to give us some housekeeping and logistical pieces. Thanks, Lily.
And thank you everyone so much for joining us today. So if you're just coming in now, Spanish interpretation is available by clicking the globe icon in your toolbar. Our interpreter Claudio will be there waiting for you. Closed captioning is also available by clicking the show captions button on your toolbar. And we will also have the full agenda and bios for all speakers and awardees available on the webpage. As we introduce them today, we're not going to take time to read their whole bios because we want to get to the good stuff, but we still want to give you access to that information. We are recording the event and it will be shared afterwards on our website, along with the slides from our presenters. And when the event ends, your browser will take you to a short survey, and we would really, really value getting your feedback. We take a lot of time to make sure that we're making this event as valuable for you all as possible. We have a very full agenda and we're gonna have a big audience today. So unfortunately, we will not be able to take questions directly from the audience, but please feel free to use the chat and we will be able to hopefully use that to have some more conversations in the future. So I'm going to hand it back to Whitney now.
Thank you so much, Lily. And thank you all for joining us today for our annual Fair Housing Symposium. I am over the moon and excited to have so many of you all joining us here today. This event is put on by our Municipal Engagement Initiative program. I get the pleasure of working alongside my colleagues, Lily Link, Monica Keel, Sade Ratliff, and it is a pleasure to really do this work, and this program has been a labor of love from all of us here. I'm Whitney Demetrius, and as the Director of Fair Housing and Municipal Engagement, it is really intentional, the work that we do. We understand that doing this work, it relies on bringing more voices to the table, empowering and amplifying residents and stakeholders who make sure that they understand, right? That housing stability is core to gaining access to broader opportunities, right? The ability for folks to be able to thrive. And so as the value of a quality, affordable home extends beyond the provision of shelter, and as a pivotal driver of individual and community success, we understand that where one lives determines so much about their livelihood, where they go to school, where they access food and healthy food, and if they're able to play outside and partake in the environment. And so we see this work as essential and pivotal. And so we understand that so much is at stake when it comes to the conversation of housing and furthering fair housing and identifying impediments to fair housing. So we feel privileged to really do this work. This fair housing work is justice work, right? This idea of community engagement and uplifting voices closest to the need is of utmost importance. And so on behalf of MEI, we truly thank you all for being here, and also our entire team at CHAPA as we continue to be committed to putting fair housing at the forefront of all of our work. We really appreciate all of our sponsors, both for the entire agency, but more specifically to that fund MEI. A special thank you to our TD Bank sponsor for sponsoring our event each year, and particularly this year, and in making sure that we can bring you all together to both commemorate fair housing as well as to charge ourselves right? To charge ourselves in this moment to ensure that we are advancing fair housing in a responsible way, that we are affirmatively furthering fair housing and doing that ongoing work, not just during this month, but throughout the year. So, one of the things about CHAPA is we started as a statewide coalition of business and civic and nonprofit, faith, and other leaders, much like yourselves today here on this call, who were speaking out about the need of more housing across Massachusetts. Over CHAPA's more than 50-year history, founded in the civil rights movement, we've borne witness to causes and effects of exclusionary housing policies. And so due to this history and this understanding, we really aim to focus our framework targeting equity and access as really a call to action, with an idea of putting planning and prosperity and preservation and with people first as a focus of our work. When President Lyndon Johnson signed the Act 56 years ago, prohibiting housing discrimination, he was quoted as saying, "Now, with this bill, the voice of justice speaks again. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country, is part of the American way of life." That quote is still a charge for today to ensure fair housing for all. We understand that this law stands on the feet and the back of so many who have advocated and fought over the many years. We understand that only days after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, that this bill was put into place. And so we're really mindful around both commemorating the great work that has been done, because we understand Dr. King understood that housing was a gateway so that people could thrive. And we understand even more so that there's so much more that we need to do as we look forward to fair housing. Fair housing is a duty year round, and we hope you will join us in the effort throughout the year to ensure that mandate in all of our programmatic work, all of our policy work, all of our ground root work, grassroots work, and what have you. So there's so much at stake. If we fail to do this, if we fail to move responsibly, if we fail to ensure and utilize the fair housing tools we have and be innovative around what systems and practices and policies we need to ensure the future we want to see. So we're excited to hear about this topic around responsible artificial intelligence and algorithms and housing and lending and how we can do that responsibly. By hearing from Dr. Michael Akinwumi from the National Fair Housing Alliance. We're excited to hear from the recent study Advancing Fair Housing in Greater Boston, voices from the field, right? Hearing from the people connected to the work directly, to think about what fair housing actually is, to define it, to talk about what the impediments to that is, and to give us some recommendations on the policies and how we need to move forward. This moment is definitely a moment where we're excited. It's exciting to see fair housing policies in the governor's Affordable Homes Act. It's exciting to know that the final guidelines for AFFH are coming out soon under the Biden administration. But really what we want to charge you all today is really a call to action to get involved, to join our Fair Housing Committee, to join us in this work, and excited today to hear from all of you all. I'm going to turn it over now to Dan Weaver. He is the Regional Director at the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Dan, please join me in welcoming Dan for our framing remarks. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Whitney. That's a great introduction to your wonderful few hours here together. Over the next 3 hours, you'll receive lots of information and resources, but take away the desire to think about fair housing, not just this month, but throughout the year. HUD is realizing the full promise of the Fair Housing Act through the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, or AFFH. The Fair Housing Act not only prohibits discrimination, but it also directs HUD to ensure that the agency and its program participants proactively take meaningful actions to overcome patterns of segregation, promote fair housing choice, eliminate disparities in housing-related opportunities, and foster inclusive communities that are free from discrimination. This is the Fair Housing Act's mandate to affirmatively further fair housing. The AFFH interim final rule restoring affirmatively furthering fair housing definitions and certifications remains in effect during the ongoing AFFH rulemaking. The AFFH interim final rule requires program participants to submit certifications that they will affirmatively further fair housing in connection with their consolidated plans, annual action plans, and PHA plans. To support these certifications, the interim final rule creates a voluntary fair housing planning process, but does not require program participants to undertake any specific type of fair housing planning to support their certifications. And HUD is also available to provide technical assistance to support program participants conducting voluntary fair housing planning. On February 9th, 2023, HUD published a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register to fulfill the promise of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. The proposed rule aims to remedy the effects of the long history of discrimination in housing and will help foster opportunity in communities across the country where every resident can thrive. This proposed rule meets President Biden's call from his first days in office to fully enforce the Fair Housing Act, outlined in the memorandum on redressing our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies. To learn more about AFFH and where we are in the regulatory process, please go to hud.gov/AFFH. Chicago and environmental justice is an example of HUD's work. On May 12th, 2023, HUD announced an agreement with the City of Chicago and community groups to advance environmental justice, to alleviate existing and prevent future environmental burdens, such as pollution and its negative health effects, and increase opportunities for environmentally burdened communities to participate in decision-making processes. Under this agreement, the City of Chicago will complete a comprehensive study of environmental burdens, health conditions, and social stressors across the city and use that study to inform and advance reforms to land use, permitting, and environmental enforcement policies and procedures. HUD is also providing funding with more than $16 million available through the American Rescue Plan. It recognized that fair housing enforcement and education and outreach services are an essential component of protecting people from housing discrimination. Through the ARP, HUD awarded more than $16 million in supplemental funding to nonprofit organizations to address fair housing inquiries, complaints, investigations, education and outreach activities, and the cost of delivering or adapting services during the pandemic. Also, HUD, together with our fair housing partners at the state level, made over $26 million available to 10,000 victims of discrimination since January of 2021. These funds were made available through our complaint process, through compliance agreements, and other forms of public relief. In 2023, HUD updated its Notice of Funding Opportunity template for all programs. It uses competitive awards made by the department, and HUD can demonstrate the experience and capacity to promote racial equity in all its programs. And finally, in December 2021, HUD made clear through guidance that the use of special purpose credit programs to help address inequalities and barriers to credit and home ownership is lawful under the Fair Housing Act. Concurrently, HUD's Office of Fair Housing issued a statement noting that special purpose credit programs are tools that can serve as remedies for disparities in access to home ownership. I look forward to a wonderful few hours learning about high-profile topics that CHAPA's introducing. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's definitely a hopeful moment. Lots of great work that is happening. And I too am looking forward to our panelists and our presenters here today. and hearing from their expertise. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Sade Ratliff, to introduce our next speaker.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sade Ratliff. As Whitney has said many times, but I will say again, thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited for the presentation and the panel that is to follow. So I will start by introducing Dr. Michael Akinwumi, who will present for us first. Dr. Akinwumi is the Chief Responsible AI Officer, and he should be pinned on your screen now. He works at the National Fair Housing Alliance, or NAFA, whose website I will put in the chat shortly. And I won't eat up any more of our time because he has some exciting stuff to share with you all today. So Dr. Akinwumi, feel free to take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Sade, for the warm introduction. And hello, everyone. I hope the weather is beautiful wherever you are right now. So to begin my presentation, I'm going to pose a question to you. And I hope that at the end of my presentation, you would have answer to that question, because I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question. But before I tell you the question, I'm going to teach you another meaning of AI. Besides, of course, those of us in fair housing, we know that AI could mean analysis of impediments. But I'm going to give you two different meanings because they will help you to answer the question that I'm going to pose to you. So AI, we all know it means artificial intelligence, but it could also mean another impediment. So the question is, how can artificial intelligence not be another impediment in housing? So I hope that at the end of my presentation, you would have an answer to that question. But to help to guide you through answering that question, I'd like you to think of how artificial intelligence should be defined in housing. And I'll also like you to think about some applications of AI in housing. So I'll walk you through, I'll share some select examples that I think will help you answer the question that I posed to you. And thirdly, I'll also talk about the connection between artificial intelligence and the history of discrimination, history of segregation that we have in housing. And last but not the least, I'll also talk to you about why it is important that we also start thinking about how to test for fair housing violations in the age of AI. Okay, before I continue my presentation, I want to briefly tell you about the National Fair Housing Alliance. So as a civil rights organization, we work to uphold the Fair Housing Act. And two, we work to affirmatively further the Fair Housing Act. And three, our vision is that of healthy, resilient, and well-resourced communities for all. And with that out of the way, I'd like you to go along this journey of trying to understand how artificial intelligence needs to be defined, the construction of the definition of AI in housing, so that we make sure that it doesn't become another impediment. So defining artificial intelligence in housing is not a task that should be done in isolation by technologists, lawmakers, mathematical scientists, or regulators. It takes a community and intentional collaboration to define and operationalize an AI system that does not amplify or perpetuate disguised racial zoning, exclusionary zoning, racial covenants, redlining, blockbusting, and many other forms of housing impediments. It is helpful for the purposes of fair housing to think of AI as one, a system designed, developed, deployed, and monitored by human. Two, a technology that lives on data specified by or selected by human. And we all know in this age of generative AI that data manifests in different forms. For example, text, audio, image, or even numbers that many of us are so accustomed to, for example, on Excel sheet, or qualify as data. And three, it is also helpful to think of AI as a system that attempts to solve problems or tasks defined by human using code or computer language written by human, and also hardware components configured or put together by human. So it is a system that impacts every part of our lives. So I like you to think of where you live right now as a place of opportunities. So you think of the jobs, healthcare, water quality, and many other opportunities that are connected to where you live. And I want to let you know that as we speak, artificial intelligence is impacting all those different avenues of opportunities. And for the foreseeable future, it will continue to impact all those opportunities that are connected to the place where you live. So when we think about housing as a place of opportunities that is connected to opportunities, then we need to think about how housing is being used in influencing or deciding who gets access to those opportunities. So I'm going to talk to you about some areas where AI is being used in housing. So like I've said, where you live matters. Where your partner lives matters. Where your children go to school matters. The quality of water, healthcare, and job opportunities in your community, they all matter. So you need to be intentional and proactive in seeking where AI is currently being developed, where it is being used in housing, because that may impact your life, and also how AI, when it comes to it impacting your opportunities, you need to also advocate for efforts to ensure safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI in housing. For example, AI can be used or is being used to simulate the residential housing market. There are a lot of data points, for example, when it comes to the relationships between public policies, household incomes, demographics data, and economic data. So AI can be used to identify patterns in all those data to simulate what the market is going to look like, either in short term or long term, and also use that intelligence to inform policies which, if not done responsibly, may come back to hurt or impact communities of color. And also, AI is being used to leverage both good and terrible data to screen rental applications. When I talk about terrible data in tenant screening applications, I'm thinking of criminal data. I'm thinking of eviction data, which have little to nothing to do with the risk that is being predicted using screening technologies. Also, AI can be used and is being used to analyze how zoning laws impact housing affordability. AI, disguised as risk assessment and decision algorithms, can be used to automate mortgage and insurance underwriting or allocate housing resources. AI is being used to manage the experience of prospective or existing tenants. And that comes, for example, in forms of chatbots, again, due to applications based on generative AI. So now, knowing where or how AI is being used in housing, you may be asking yourself, why should you care about the development and use of AI in housing? Well, there are a lot of reasons why you should care. You may also want to think about it as, a technology that can influence or impact the opportunities that are connected to where you live. So to really center that thinking, I'm going to make a connection between housing, between the legacy of segregation and discrimination in housing, and artificial intelligence. So I've established that data is a component of AI system, artificial intelligence system. So the emergence of generative AI applications, for example, has shown that audio conversations, policy documents that we've all been working on for decades, video recordings by testers and investigators, images from evidence gathering processes, and many similar representation of realities all qualify as data. So given the history of discrimination and segregation in housing, we must look deeper into where the data that is fueling AI applications in housing. We need to ask yourself, where those data are coming from, where the processes that are generating the data that can influence where we live, where those processes are coming from. So you need to think about how racial zoning, exclusionary zoning, racial covenants, redlining, steering, and block busting, and many other discriminatory policies are forces of evil that are shaping consumer realities in housing markets and financial markets, and also leaving these discriminatory patterns or trends in the data that are fueling AI applications in housing. So then the question is, with this history of discrimination and segregation that is already in the data behind AI applications, how can AI systems built on data that represent these realities of discrimination and segregation be beneficial to all, including people of color? The answer lies in responsible use of AI in housing. The answer lies in commitment to safe, secure, and trustworthy development of AI in housing. It lies in making sure that there is transparency. Companies tell consumers when or if or how they're using AI applications in making housing decisions. Companies that are developing AI systems, they ensure that their system is inclusive. We can no longer afford not including the narratives of those that are impacted by AI in housing. We can no longer afford not using their narratives to craft an AI system that works for all. We also need to make sure that there is effective risk management system that prevents harms that come with the use of AI in housing. We want to make sure that we continuously, tirelessly advocate for impact assessment that is publicly available for us to actually review and make sure that AI applications in housing is not hurting the communities that we care about. And lastly, the answer also lies in AI literacy. As I've established that AI impacts every aspect of our lives, every fabric of our society, we can no longer afford not being part of the conversation. So we also need to inform ourselves about how AI may be impacting all these different areas of opportunities and how we can be part of the conversations or efforts to ensure that AI is developed responsibly. So I talked about AI literacy as one of the components that can help to ensure safe, secure, and trustworthy development of AI in housing. AI literacy is extremely important. And when we talk about AI, the usual participants at the table are industry, the tech industry players, advocates, and even government agencies. Now is the time for consumers to be AI literate. Now is the time for consumers to also be part of the conversation so that they can elevate their stories, and tech solutions can include the stories so that we can limit the impact that AI can have on real people. Especially, there is a study that was just published this month coming out of Stanford University, and the study shows that when you look at North America, only 1 in 5 developers of AI pay attention to fairness. Only 20% of AI developers in North America pay attention to fairness. And what does that mean? So that means that we need to make sure that we continue to elevate the importance of the laws and regulations that bind us or shape the work we do in housing, such as the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Fair Housing Act, to make sure that we constantly call attention of those who are developing AI systems to the importance of fairness in housing. And, I just shared that only 1 in 5 North American companies that are developing AI systems pay attention to the risk of discrimination that comes with AI in housing. So what does it mean? To see that only 20% of companies developing or using AI pay attention to fairness. While it could mean many things, it definitely suggests that there is at least 80% opportunities for fair housing testers and fair housing investigators to catch bad actors. How can this be possible when we know for a fact that more than 60% of recent mortgage originations or housing transactions are now digital? They are now taking place online. How do we make sure that our testers, those who are testing for or investigating fair housing violations, how can we make sure that they can catch these 80% opportunities? Part of the strategy is making sure that there is informed collaboration with those that have the technical expertise and those that have the lived experience. We know for a fact that human testers have accumulated decades of experience on their job. Human investigators have gathered decades of data on their job, including audio data, image data, and many other forms of data. We have decades of evidence to identify cases that can be won, cases that we can lose, or cases that we can settle. Now, the advent of generative AI, open data, open platforms, and software engineers that are interested in or committed to the fair housing mission is a perfect opportunity to foster collaboration with human testers and human investigators that have the lived experience, the domain knowledge, so that they can work together to make sure that, for example, we can replicate the human experience in form of digital profiles that can serve as agents, digital agents that can then go after these 80% bad actors or 80% opportunities that we have to make sure that when it comes to the use of AI in housing, it is not only safe, it is not only secure, but it's also trustworthy. And with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akinwumi. Wow. We have so much we've learned, so much we're charged with. I am going to invite your fellow panelists to join you. Alongside you, we have Jamie Williamson. She's the District Director of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And as many of us know, in this area has a long history in fair housing and much expertise. We were hopeful to be joined by John Michael Fana, formerly from Harbor Light Homes, to be part of the discussion as well. But I will turn it over to you all, because I think to Dr. Michael's question around how can we make sure that AI doesn't become another AI, another impediment to fair housing? Excited for the conversation. So I'll turn it over to you all, please.
Thank you, Whitney, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, CHAPA, for having this symposium. It's always important to be talking about this type of work that we do that's outside, sometimes that it's pushing the edges and making us think about things that we hadn't normally thought about. And I wanted to say one thing is that when Dr. Akinwumi was talking about, the impediments to housing, he was also thinking about, all of the things that it takes to get there, which I loved, is including that you got to have money, right? In order to be able to buy a house, you got to have money, which means you got to have a job, right? And so we see that as one of the first impediments when you're thinking about it, as AI can potentially have some really unfortunate consequences for people in terms of looking for a job or having access to job opportunities. And one of the things that I noticed was that's in, gathering of this data. And I kind of want to talk to you, Doctor, about this, because it seems to be one of those spaces where you say there's lots of data, but who chooses which data is put into that model? And then, how do, I guess more for all of us who are on the low end of this, not really understanding how this works. Obviously, you have to have a model, right? But tell me about the data, because one of the things that I read recently, and it has me a bit worried, is they were talking about language, right? The chat GPT, right? And I think many of us are familiar with that. That they said that they gathered the language for that from Enron. Over 600,000 emails that were put into this system that called the data and then started looking for things and making connections. But it seems to me that's inherently, given who worked at Enron and the types of emails that may have gone around, could be very bad for women and people of color because of the way in which they're making the connections to language. So can you give us more, help us understand who chose which data and where it came from?
Yeah, that's a good question. And thanks for asking that question about data. Because when we talk to, technologists, and even given my background as a data scientist, we've been taught to think that data is always factual, that data is always objective, right? And we've been taught or trained to think that there is no subjectivity that goes into deciding what data you want to use in your AI system or selecting data for your system. My short answer to your question is that humans select or decide the data, right? So now that said, usually before deciding what data you want to use in your system, the conversation usually starts with what problem you want to solve, what task you want to solve. For example, let's say mortgage underwriting. The task could be that we want to identify those who are less likely to be delinquent on their mortgage, on their mortgage, right? So the task needs to be first defined. It first needs to be specified. The objective needs to be clear. Then the responsibility of choosing or deciding the data when it comes to the use of AI in housing falls on the those who are developing the systems, because what they try to do is to identify the data which they think and hope is predictive of the problem or the task that they want to solve, right? But that is, what happens when you just think that data is always objective. But it is really important that if we want to make sure that the use of AI in housing is done responsibly, deciding the type of data, deciding the quality of the data or the veracity of the data needs to involve those who are familiar with the realities that are represented in the data, right? In one of my slides, I talked about collaboration, intentional collaboration. Those who have technical backgrounds, right, may not even have been taught about the history of injustices that are in the data. So they are more prone to thinking that data is factual. But for example, when you sit with sociologists who know the impact of data on real people, then they can talk you into seeing the other side of data, seeing that this data, for example, in credit scoring, does not even include those who are underserved, does not include those who are marginalized, does not include those who have thin files, does not include those who are underrepresented. So you start thinking of data in a different dimension. So deciding what data to use needs to be inclusive. It needs to, respect and involve diversity of perspectives so that we can make sure that the use of AI in housing is trustworthy.
So let me posit this to you. So there's a particular mortgage company that in fact uses AI to determine whether or not I'm creditworthy. They don't know everything, right? So maybe one of the ways in which they looked at that data is saying, you know, have you ever been late on anything, right? Any payments or whatever, what your credit looks like, without knowing that there are blips in credit from time to time that would be handled by an individual differently than it would be by AI, if I'm not mistaken, right? So if I go to my local banker, he knows that my husband recently passed away. And so there's some adjustments that need to be made. And during that time period, I happen to have not got everything right. Is that going to impact me negatively if they're using AI?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll share my own lived experience. So I moved from Canada about 3.5 years ago to the US, right? And in Canada, I had a very good credit score, right? But I remember the first month that I moved to the US, no one was even ready to even give me a loan or even get, a phone line and all that, right? Because why? Because I had thin file or zero credit report on my credit file, right? Now, in that situation, because again, when technologists just jump into the data, they will not be able to, adequately represent my own experience in the data and also the experience that you shared, Jamie, right? So what happens is that, and this is one of the things that we're advocating for when it comes to responsible AI, we believe that just like I shared, in every component of AI, you see humans making the decisions, right? From the data to the task to the code to the hardware, humans are making the decision, right? So in special cases like these, as part of responsible AI, we are also calling for governance, right? Because like industry players may want to, often argue, their argument is that because of efficiency, there is a limit to how many mortgages can be processed by humans. And now that we have a lot of data points, everything happening online, we want to make sure that we can assess risk. And we all know that risk is actually tied to race, right? But they come with this, defense, right? But it is really important that even when they use automated underwriting systems, for example, they have human in the loop to make decisions at the end of using the outcomes that come out of these systems. And assuming that they are transparent, we also want to make sure that they can explain the decision. And like the case or the example that you shared, usually in the process of explaining the decision, in the process of gathering the information that consumers can use to contest that decision, when humans are in the loop of AI system, then human can have the flexibility to listen to these individuals' experiences so that they have the authority, or hopefully they are authorized when possible, to override the decisions that are coming out of the system. So blindly automating the process and taking humans out of the loop would hurt consumers, represented by my story, represented by your story, right? So it's really important to make sure that we have humans, when possible, to override the system, because we know that the system can be controlled.
So in essence, what I'm also hearing you say is, if you've gotten denied, that you should go back and ask why you were denied access to that credit, because you may need to then add a narrative to that, right? To explain a narrative.
Yeah, that's right. Usually when it comes to AI automated systems, there is this phenomenon called automation bias. So as humans, we tend to think that everything that comes out of the computer is accurate, right? Even though we have adverse action notices, requirement for disclosure on the part of the lenders. So humans, once they're told that, well, it's just based on your credit score that was computed by some algorithms, we may not have the courage to even ask questions, right? For example, at the National Fair Housing Alliance, we've put together a framework that we call purpose, process, and monitoring that can actually be used to frame the questions that we want to ask when we seek for explanation. So yes, to your questions, we can, those who experience adverse actions, they need to, ask for explanations. And not only that they need to ask for explanations, right? There's also a need for contestability. They need to get the information that they can use to contest the decision. And that was why I talked about AI literacy. Like, we can't afford to sit back and say, well, AI is mysterious, is a black box, knowing fully well that humans put together the system. So yes, they need to ask for explanations. Yes, they need to ask for information that they can use to contest the decisions and also address their situation.
Okay. Speaking of that, I guess I want to take it a little bit further with thinking about AI in terms of, for example, one of the stories that I heard is that AI can be used in making decisions in insurance. Perhaps that there is, if you've used insurance before, that you get points, so to speak, how much you use your insurance. So if something bad has happened to you, all of a sudden, it's harder for you to get insurance. If it's harder for you to get insurance, sometimes it also seems to be harder for you to get access to mortgage and or even a job. So can we talk a little bit about that, and how those kind of that interplay it can impact decisions that get made?
Yeah, well, so that's a very good question. So I actually spent some time working in insurance, and one of the things I learned in insurance is the business of discrimination, right? So when I heard underwriters tell me that, well, we're in this business to discriminate, it took a while for me to really understand what they mean, right? But again, being on both sides, on the business side, developing the models and all that, right? So one thing I know for a fact is that risk prediction, right, needs to be intentional when we think about insurance, right? Again, not only that in insurance, because it's something that is, it's based on location, right? For example, homeowner insurance, the data you're going to use to assess the property, or to even evaluate or value the property, or even assess the homeowner, they are all connected to the location, right? And then when you think about the history, it's almost nearly impossible to think of how to even remove bias from, such use of AI in housing, in insurance, right? Same thing even with auto insurance, right? So, but like I said, I always come back to this principle of like responsible AI, responsible use of AI, be it in insurance, homeowner insurance, because again, when you think about crime, right, which is some of the data that for right or wrong reasons, insurance companies may want to use that or factor it into deciding premium, right? And even in terms of like deciding premium, they think about, well, the frequency, how frequently you've had claims, right? Or the severity of the claims that you have experienced. Now, if you live in an area where you know that the transport system is so inefficient or the roads are bad, we all know that your chances of increasing your frequency of having claims is going to go up, right? So they are not factoring this, maybe they are not factoring this into the risk scores they're developing, or the premium, and other considerations that they have, right? So if I would say irresponsible use of AI in insurance in such ways, without really paying attention to all these different nuances that I mentioned, may come back later to have cumulative effect on all homeowners and also impact them. But again, responsible use of AI in developing insurance, responsible use that is not only limited to the narrow scope of thinking about the frequency, right? Or thinking about the severity of the claim experienced by a group of people that have not been given the opportunities in the first instance. That narrow view will continue to hurt, consumers. So hopefully there will be a change of approach to using AI in insurance in that way, so that at least it can address the issues that you shared.
Okay, you mentioned something about crime, and one of the other things that I had read, and again, these are just I'm out there reading all kinds of stuff, and I don't know. And this is the other piece of that is how do I know if data is in fact valid, if it's good data, if it's good information? this is one of the things I worry about. If I was to say what keeps me up at night in regards to this, it is the information, is the resources that I'm going to. How do I know that those are good, solid resources that can help me help this process along, or to do some work? Are there ways for us to look at research? And then also part two of that would be, do they look at research that is done that, let's say, for example, if you wanted to debias something in the insurance process or in the mortgage lending process, do they take into consideration research that has been done that would be favorable to people of color? I know we always do research that's bad, that that we can't pay, we're this, we're that. Is there good research that gets plugged in that kind of offsets the bad information that's been given?
Well, my short answer is I hope they pay attention to research that, for example, talks about how they can affirmatively further fair housing. In fact, later today, I'm going to be speaking on at an event where we're also going to be talking about some of the techniques, AI techniques that can be used to remove bias from AI applications in housing. Right? So, to your first question about validity of data. So it really depends on who is looking at the data, right? So we know, for example, when it comes to tenant screening applications, there are a lot of data that are being used that shouldn't even be there because, the accuracy of the data, right? The validity of the data is in question, right? So if you're a developer and you're looking at the data, and maybe that's the only thing that your organization has provided access to, the tendency is there for you to think that this data is factual, right? Or when you are not there when the data aggregators are resolving the data to the identity of a person. For example, if you search my name online, you're going to see multiple people that are bearing my name. Now, the fact that you find some, data source somewhere that says that this is Michael Akinwumi, does that mean that represents who I am, right? So when data aggregators resolve the data and tie it to an identity, it may be difficult for the person that is developing the systems, the AI application, it may be difficult for them to even think about how valid the data is. But here is where consumers actually come in. And this is where advocating for policy changes that call for transparency, that call for explainability, that calls for contestability, that calls for preservation of privacy actually comes in. So when there is transparency, when those who are developing the systems let us know when, how, or if they're using AI in their system, what type of data they are using, the sources of data they are using, when there is adequate disclosure to consumers about where they are getting the data from, right? Then consumers can help them to even contest the validity of the data, right? Because the consumers, these are people that are impacted. For example, if you are telling me that, well, I've been in the US for 20 years and I don't have this much credit, I can tell you, because you're talking about me, I can tell you that I know myself so well. Thank you for providing that information, but I'm going to contest it. So in the process, with that collaboration, working together and with adequate disclosure and transparency, then the validity of the data can be contested and also corrected.
So it sounds like to me, we're going to have to teach people how to start contesting things, right? It's time for us to have these conversations about, where did you get the information on me? Because I was thinking about, as you were saying that, when they're looking at the data, and because, and it was interesting because I was looking at some data and I wanted to go to a site, and that site said, we're doing this, I guess, cookies. And I don't really understand cookies, but the notion that somebody's following me, right? That's my understanding of cookies, is that there's a person following me, or there's some bot that's following me around, seeing what I do when I do it, and then trying to provide me with services that may be value to me based on what I have said. One, I think that's Big Brother in a whole other way, and we all ought to be thinking about that, right? Our ability to actually say no, but still have access. which I noticed that it doesn't always let you have access if you say, no, I don't want you following me around. But I thought about that in terms of my searches and my buying habits. Will those impact decisions in AI? As you know, are they looking at Jamie Williamson and then saying, here's what we know about her? And then, I mean, if that were that's kind of scary thinking about it. Is that possible that they could then say, here's everything that we know about her, and she would make a horrible this, she won't pay her bill, she won't do this. Well, what if that's the case? I mean, or I guess maybe is it even possible? Could they make a decision based on my footprint in that space or my lack of footprint in that space?
Yeah, I really like your analogy about cookies, right? So I have a 3-year-old, and I can tell you that if he knows that, daddy always comes home with cookies and all that, right? Wherever I go, he would want to follow me around, right? Now, to your question about search and buying habits, I mean, one of the signatures, the signature I have in my work email is that AI is not good, bad, or neutral, right? And, I have a lived experience when I was in Europe, right? So I moved from Nigeria, I went to Europe to study. The very first day that I got to Europe, I got a computer, went online, and there was a credit card that was presented to me. And I was in Europe for almost 4 years. I will tell you that was a credit card that I used throughout that 4 years to build my credit profile in Europe. So that's a good application because it helped me. But how did they get that data? Of course, from cookies, from my shopping experience online, from my buying experience. And because of the geolocation data, they learned that, well, this person has moved from one geography to another, then probably it needs it to settle down, right? Now, take that forward to generative AI. Now that we have generative AI, chatbots, and also more digital footprint online, right? What happens is that there are now what is called personalization algorithms. So algorithms that can really predict or identify your nature. Again, I can see your facial expressions very creepy, right? Because you don't want to give out all these data and all that, right? But by virtue of cookies and a lot of footprints that we leave online, right? They can have access to this data. But the good thing is that we know for a fact that some of these algorithms or these technologies, if they are not paying attention to preserving privacy, even if, let's say, you've given consent, or maybe you didn't even give consent, they know a lot about what almost everyone is doing online, that they can try to maybe even identify your profiles, your marketing or customer profiles, right? So consent, it's great, but the consent only applies to, the moment in time. I always say like moment in time, because it depends on other uses that you may not even have signed up for, right?
Did we get something?
Sorry?
Is she getting ready or she still refusing?
Somebody is on. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay. All right. But so like I was saying, so personalization algorithms, and of course, lastly, we currently don't have a federal privacy law, right? Though there's one in process, like the American Privacy Rights Act. So if at least that law is passed, the expectation is that these companies, they no longer have options. Then there's going to be a curb or a limit on how much personal data that they can have on us, and the level of intrusion that they can have. But that said, I also want to say there may be some good use of having access to this. In fact, speaking to the presentation that I'm doing later today, if we're thinking about debiasing AI system, you need access to protected data. And some of this protected data may also qualify as personal data, right? And without access to this personal data, like the protected data, one may not be able to remove bias from the system. So I think one just needs to review the cases as they occur and then make sure that the principle of responsible AI is considered when you are assessing or analyzing those use cases.
Okay. And so now back a while ago, and and it's still a conversation about the way in which we look at the value of housing. Mm-hmm. How does and can AI play a role in that when we're looking at appraisals, right? And I've noticed this is that If my house were in this neighborhood, it's worth one amount of money. If it's in this neighborhood, it's worth another amount of money. And is there a way for us to look at that and attempt to make change? I mean, can AI be used in a positive way to kind of undo some of the damage that historical racism has done?
Yeah, that's a good question. Great question. And if you give me a whole day to talk about it, I probably will. Last year at the National Fair Housing Alliance, we actually did like a landmark walk on appraiser bias. And also we hosted a hackathon that focused on appraiser bias. And we looked at a type of AI called AVM, automated valuation model. And part of the takeaways from that was, again, I would say irresponsible use of AI in appraising values. We established that it can actually hurt communities of color, because we looked at the data, we looked at the model, right? And think about it, what data goes into AVM? At least the AVM, the automated valuation model, the appraiser model that we looked into, right? Well, you need to think about the history of appraiser bias. Human appraisers, they've made some decisions that are, documented, represented in the data, right? And then AI is going to take this traumatized, biased data and then try to make some predictions, right? If that is all we have, and you're just looking at, the information you have about the homeowner, the information you have about the location, the information you have about the property, then you may have a situation where all AI will be doing is just perpetuating or amplifying the history of appraiser bias, right? But that said, we've also seen instances where AI can be used, again, because AI, when used responsibly, has the potential to leverage new novel data that even some basic statistical techniques may not be able to leverage to identify patterns, right? So that said, the Urban Institute, they've actually done extensive study. They issued 4 different reports on appraiser AVM, automated valuation models. And working with them on this, reviewing some of the reports, what we realized is that if the data is actually zeroed in on the information that you have about the property, not just looking at the exterior information about the property, because the exterior information, of course, will require one to do comparative analysis. But you also need to know that there's a lot that goes on in the house, the interior information in the house. And one of the reports actually elevates the role that interior information can use. So AI, for example, computer vision algorithms can be used. And there are tech companies that are also looking into this to extract information that pay attention to how homeowners have been taking care of the interior, the inside of the house, and then you can use that to inform the decisions that go into the automated valuation models.
So it sounds to me like it's, what is that, Carfax? Is it the Carfax guy? Where they know what you've done to your car, so they know how well it might be, what the value may be, right? I'm only a one owner. I did my oil every time. So, I mean, that's kind of interesting, right? Is this that if they were able to look at what I have done in terms of even maintenance on my house on a regular basis, right? That the value is probably greater because I've done regular maintenance as opposed to not doing any maintenance, and where I spent my money in that. You said something, and I want to kind of pull back, and I don't know if you had talked about this before, but thinking about the fact that when AI is gathering data, it's gathering past data, things that have happened in the past, and then it's predicting the future. But if the past is built on a lie, if it's got faulty information, if all of that how good are those predictors then, if the information that it's sitting on using actually can't predict, or it's going to have a negative prediction? And is that the case, or are we starting to see new data being used?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always wish I have the power to go into the future, know what the future looks like, and then come back to the present, right? The best we can do is to use our history to inform our future. And that's what AI is trying to do, right? So, and I always say, well, maybe we should even be grateful that AI is bringing all of us together because it's reflecting our past. So it's like a mirror that is showing to our face what our past is like, right? So that said, again, one thing that I know, again, based on the work we're doing, is that when you look at the history, when you look at the past, and you try to correct for the history of discrimination or disparities that exist, right? Looking into alternative data when used responsibly, because I also like to emphasize that alternative data may not be panacea to many of these issues. So taking mortgage underwriting as an example, I mean, usually industries gravitate towards credit data. And we all know that credit report is rife with underrepresentation of people of color, right? When you think of those that have thin files, when you think of those that are credit invincible. In fact, based on some of the work we've done here, we know that America has dual credit market, right? So where, the mainstream market, you have majority white, assessing their credit needs. And then people of color, they're going to the fringe market, and the data coming from the fringe market is not making up to the credit reporting agencies, right? So that said, when you think about just looking at data from this aspect alone, you also need to think about alternative data. That is data, for example, that are not on the credit report, right? Data like, the history of how frequently you're paying your rent, how frequently you're paying your utility. And even when it comes to, like you said, like maintenance, right? There are some solutions out there that homeowners can use to capture the history of how they are like the maintenance. So when this history comes together and the history represents alternative data, right? And then the history also represents the longitudinal aspect of the data. Longitudinal data here is not just static data that are maybe only tells a snapshot of your story, but this is data you've been collecting over the month, right? So when all these come together, and then there is also access to the right algorithm, right? The right math, then the issue can be addressed. And I always like to say this, like when I say the right math, again, we all need to know that math is nothing but a symbolic representation of thoughts. So that, for example, lenders are saying this outcome is coming out of math. That doesn't make it objective. So it's still a representation of thoughts of those that are developing the system. So that's that would be my answer or response to your question.
Well, thank you. Speaking of math, I just want to stop and do this. I love this book, and it really is. It's something everyone. It's called Weapons of Math Destruction. As somebody who's just, I'm not a good math person. I hated math. Did not do it. Found out later I've got dyscalculia, so I felt much better. It wasn't me. It was my brain. But that's what I find is really interesting is that when we're thinking of that, it's just math. But the reality is that it's not just math. It has to have math with something else, right? It can't be math on its own. And I know, matter of fact, in this particular book, the author is talking about a school in Washington, D.C., where they actually used AI. They came up with an assessment on what made a good teacher. And they were trying to fix the problems of the school, right? They said, we've got to move in. And what ended up happening, and the long and short of it is that it didn't take into consideration what happened before the school began and what happened after the school ended. And so what they were looking at is they said, a good teacher, if a teacher is a good teacher, when the student goes from 5th to 6th grade, that if you looked at when they came in at 5th and then they ended at 6th, there should be some increase in knowledge. What it didn't consider was the fact that, and remember, they're doing this by scores, right? So they're using test scores. What it didn't include was the fact that if the test scores when they were in 5th grade were inflated by teachers from the 4th grade, right? And so what they found out was, in fact, that the testing that was done, because the teachers, in fact, were being held accountable by all of these tests and what the students were doing. So now, this person really, when they came into 5th grade, wasn't really at that level, right? Now, all of a sudden, they are being tested, and these next line of teachers are being held accountable for what the other teachers, in fact, had done wrong, which they had inflated those scores. And so this woman had lost her job. And the problem was, everywhere she went to try to say there's something must be wrong. Everyone thinks I'm a wonderful teacher, right? The parents love me, the students love me, my students are moving forward. There's great movement, but something isn't right. And she lost her job. The good news is she got a better job. We love it when, bad things happen to good people, that they end up in a good space. So for her, great. But what she talks about is how frustrating it was to be able to even get the data, be able to, as you're saying, there's an issue of transparency, but how do we demand transparency? I know that in the employment world, as the EEOC, we do get to demand some things, right? But you got to get to us at that level in order for us to be able to demand it. And so it comes down to the people who are building these, platforms where they're being used, are saying this is in fact, proprietary information. It's what makes our platform or what you're buying from us of value. We can't just put it out there in the street. We can't make it so that it's transparent. How do we handle that? Because that's the response that they pretty much gave her, right? Is that we can't tell you how we did it. We don't know. It's almost nobody knows how the sausage is made, but they know that the sausage didn't taste good, but we don't know how to fix it, right? So can you tell me how a little bit about how do we help? How do we find out how the sausage is made, and what can we do when we think there's something wrong? And I know we talked a little bit about this, but I really want to understand.
Yeah. So I always like when I hear from, when I hear the defense that, oh, it's proprietary data, it's proprietary technology. And as a consumer, I would like to say, well, I'm proprietary. You're capturing data about me, right? So everything about me is also proprietary, right? But, there is information they can share while still respecting their intellectual property. But that said, by the way, I really like the book that you shared, Weapons of Math Destruction. And I really encourage the audience to look into that book. Another book that I'll recommend is Unmasking AI. When folks read, oh, you have that too. Great. So,
that was my next recommendation.
yeah. And I've met the authors at conferences and all that, right? So please look into that. In fact, when I was in insurance, I made sure that everyone on my team read Weapons of Math Destruction, including my manager, my VP of underwriting, because I wanted to make sure that they get the issue, right? And one thing I really like about the story you shared from Weapons of Math Destruction is that it calls attention to what lies between defining the problem you want to solve and the solution to the problem, right? So it shows that there is a process that is connecting the two ends together. And the more you look into the process, the more you see human narratives in that process, right? So the book is very, very powerful, and it has a lot of anecdotes that can help bring into focus some of the issues that I've raised. Now, to your question about how to find out what is going on with the system, what consumers can do, and all that, right? There's a couple of federal bills that we're also looking into advocating for, and they all relate to AI transparency. They all relate to AI procurement, because sometimes when it comes to the issue of intellectual property, right, the defense could be that, well, we didn't develop this, we purchased it. But again, we're also advocating that there is information that, solution providers need to start collecting so that, the areas or surface of liability can be apportioned as appropriate, right? Now, again, two things that I like to say, and I've said this earlier on, is the issue of transparency, is the issue of explainability and contestability. In as much as I would like to say, based on excellent work that we're doing here at NAFA, I mean, when I say excellent work, I mean real work where we are actually developing machine learning models. We're testing them, underwriting, and also pricing, and also different fairness techniques. So we have a report that was published yesterday, and there's a webinar that is going on later today, right? So based on the work we are doing, I could feel, there may be a tendency for me to say, well, these are the changes or the policy recommendations. But again, without adequate disclosure or transparency, right? Many of those recommendations could just be like, me closing my eyes and throwing dirt at the wall and hoping that something will stick, right? So I think the starting point, and we've shared this also with regulators, is transparency. And when we talk about transparency, I always like to say is it needs to include the principle of contestability, making sure that the information, you not only disclose when or what data is going into the system, and they can actually share information about the data. And I know this for a fact because of my experience. I know that this data that we all see most of the time is not what eventually contributes to the final decision. There's a lot of transformations that go into the data before it eventually gets to the point where they make decision. So they can disclose aspects of the data that is not proprietary, right? So not only disclosure or being transparent, but they also need to provide the information that can be used to contest. And more importantly, consumers also need to be AI literate. And AI literacy here does not mean you have to have PhD in computer science or PhD in math. No, there's a lot of things, because think about it, I don't need to have PhD in math or PhD in computer science for me to know that if I wear the wrong shirt or something, it's not going to size me, because it's something that impacts me. So AI literacy calls for consumers to also advocate for their own cause, right? So they need to also ask the right questions, make sure that those who are developing these systems, they provide for them the information that they need so that they can make sure that the system is not harmful, the system is safe, the system is also valid when it comes to the decision that is coming out of it.
Wow, that is incredible. And I will tell you this, what a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I thank you so much for all of what you are doing with us and for us. It's outstanding. And, for those of you who are listening, I kind of want to give some wrap-up takeaways. We've got to become AI literate, right? That's very important. We've got to be able to do that. We've got to be able to push back, ask questions, know what is going into the soup, know how it's being made. We want to push for transparency in all that is done. We need to ensure that the work that's being done and we're building AI, that it is contestable. That means we have our right to be able to say, hey, we need to take a different look at this. It ought to be ethical, right? We need to demand that there's some ethical application of AI. And of course, again, transparency and ensuring that we all know what's going on, how it impacts us. And just so that you know, I really do encourage you, if you haven't read this, it's Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill and Unmasking AI by Joy Bolawami. I think I got it somewhat. I might have, but again, some two great books that will give you a really good flavor, easy to read, easy to get into. And I promise you, if you're not thinking about AI, you should be, because it's going to impact every asset, every facet of our lives. And so it's important that we, as people who are doing this good work, understand it and share with people how it's impacting them. So again, I want to thank you all very much for listening to this panel. Doctor, again, just outstanding work and information. I'm sure he's available to ask, to reach out to. I believe there is some information, they put it up there. Again, Whitney, thank you so much, and your team and CHAPA for putting this together. What a great conversation. And Sade, again, thank you. And Monica, and we appreciate it. So have a great day.
Yeah, thank you,
Wonderful.
Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Michael. Thank you, Jamie. As you all can see, we had the right person for the job to moderate that conversation. Thank you all so much for your expertise. Wow, what an invigorating discussion. I hope we all feel that much more literate around AI after that conversation, and also charging ourselves to learn and to know more. I started to do a summary. Jamie summed it up just perfectly as to our charge and some of the key takeaways from that work. So I hope that this sparks something for you, and I appreciate those recommendations for the reads, and folks will hopefully reach out to the folks at NAPA and otherwise to learn more on this field, because it is of utmost importance as we look to the future and the present condition of fair housing discrimination. One of the things that was pointed that Dr. Michael talked about today is about hearing from the consumer and hearing from the voices. And what a great segue to our next presentation. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. James Jennings, who was lead advisor and lead project developer on researcher on the recent report Advancing Fair Housing in Greater Boston, Massachusetts, Voices from the Field. It has been a pleasure, CHAPA, to be part of this, play a small role in this study as fiscal agent and sort of advisor, but this understood that this came out of some great work around thinking about what it means to examine the current condition of fair housing. I was championed by Senator Lydia Edwards. The funding coming out of the Economic Development Bill. It has been amazing to see the work that you've been able to put together. Definitely want to uplift many of the interviewers and study participants and focus group folks who are here on the call today, who are part of uplifting their voices to really identify not only what is fair housing, what are the barriers, and what are the recommendations. So I will turn it over to Dr. James Jennings. Please join me in a virtual applause. He is, again, Professor Emeritus at the Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts, which many of you all may know him from, but also a lead researcher on this study. So I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Dr. James.
Well, thank you very much. You're very kind, Whitney. And I have to say, before getting into my very brief presentation, before turning it over to one of my colleagues, Denise Paz, that I've already learned so much. So this is really wonderful. And your overview, your opening framework for today's discussion is so critically important and timely. So thank you. The title of the study that Whitney is referring to is Advancing Fair Housing in Greater Boston, Massachusetts, Voices from the Field. And the other co-authors include Karina Paz, Ashley Harding, Bob Terrell. But I also want to acknowledge again Whitney and her CHAPA team. They were really very helpful, not only in providing important ideas, but moving the study forward. So I really appreciate it. And there were other people who also helped us with the interviews and the focus groups. But due to time, I won't go through all their names. You could get their names in the acknowledgement in the actual report. Now, this report had 4 major goals. One, the first goal was to help raise public and community-based awareness about fair housing and its scope and implications for monitoring and enforcement, especially as it involves racial and ethnic minorities. A second goal, and these are definitely related, but a second goal was to broaden discussion about fair housing, where fair housing advocates communicate with other community and civic voices. We wanted to make sure that this was not just a report coming out of all the important work that fair housing advocates are doing. We wanted to get the opinions and the reactions and the ideas of people involved with other kinds of social justice issues, community empowerment issues, to sort of, again, to broaden this discussion around fair housing, something that still continues to be not as broad as it should be. The third major goal was to assist with ensuring that narratives calling for increasing the housing supply and more affordable housing is conjoined with a narrative of affirmatively furthering fair housing. If you had a chance to look at the op-ed and the article op-ed in the Globe and the article in Planetizen that State Senator Lydia Edwards and myself co-authored, you know that this is not only our concern, but the concern of a lot of people. As we talk about responding to the housing crisis, it has to be within a framework of fair housing, lest we not use more housing as really an important social and economic opportunity to guarantee that everyone has access to all kinds of community assets. And the fourth major goal was to encourage greater local government attention to the history of fair housing and how institutional racism has shaped, at least in the greater Boston area, because this was our focus, suburban white communities today. But I want to emphasize, it's not just white suburbanites. It's also new groups that are coming into our society, into our communities, who need to understand how we got here and how our communities look the way they look. And just a few words about the methodology. This involved 36 community and civic activists working in the Boston metropolitan region, but also other parts of Massachusetts. They were interviewed over 2 phases in 2023. And basically, again, we wanted to tap what they thought were local obstacles and challenges in implementing fully fair housing regulations and activities. We used a focus group in some meetings. We looked at the literature, including agency and public documents, and we did collect some hard data, census data and administrative data, but we also took advantage in a positive way of a lot of good data that other groups have been collecting. And of course, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So in our report, you'll see reference to other studies that have been done that were relevant to what we were doing. Based on these interviews and these meetings, 5 major fair housing challenges emerged. The first one, there is a limited public and community-based awareness about the scope of fair housing and fair housing enforcement entities. And here, of course, I'm referring to affirmatively furthering fair housing. And I know we already know what I'm about to read, but let me read it to you again, because I want to emphasize some points. And this is the definition of affirmatively furthering fair housing based on federal regulations. And I'm quoting here, means taking proactive steps beyond simply combating discrimination, to foster more inclusive communities and access to community assets for all persons protected by the Fair Housing Act. More specifically, it means taking steps proactively to address significant disparities in access to community assets, to overcome segregated living patterns and support and promote integrated communities, to end racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, and to foster and maintain compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws, end of quote. And I wanted to repeat that, remind ourselves that fair housing, again, is not just doing the right thing. It's not just immediate discrimination, as much as that is, but it's something that's very, very intersectoral, because we want our communities, all people, to live in communities that are healthier and where they can realize the best of their potential. The second major finding had to do with the lack of ample resources for implementing, monitoring, and enforcing fair housing. If my colleague and friend Bob Turo were able to be here, the phrase he used, a lack of minimal fair housing infrastructure in a lot of places. So that was another major finding. 3, a disconnect between calls to increase the Massachusetts housing supply and affordable housing with an affirmatively furthering fair housing lens. And this is what I mentioned earlier. These 2 things cannot proceed in silos. They have to be related, lest we don't use it as an opportunity to overcome some problems that have risen from history, but are still with us because of a lot of current practices. 4, absence of attention or actions to address the impacts of historical racial discrimination or racial discrimination today in many cities and towns. This discussion, you know, a lot of the interviews said the discussions we're having today, for example, are just completely absent in some places. And I think that has to be changed. And the fifth major challenge to fair housing is lack a stronger emphasis on accessible, equitable, and efficient public transportation as critical for advancing fair housing in suburban communities. And again, just another example that we have to move from silos. When we talk about fair housing, we have to talk about it in a very intersectoral way. So public transportation is critical to move fair housing forward. Based on these observations, based on these challenges, the team synthesized the input we received into 6 recommendations for the state and 8 recommendations for municipal governments and community groups. And again, I'm not going to go into detail. You can read it for yourself, but 14 recommendations that these 36 community and civic activists believe are important to move the fair housing agenda forward in a comprehensive and intersectoral way. But I do want to say that the most important theme that emerged in the long run, and this reminds me of the last speaker's comments, the most important thing that emerged was the need for community awareness and participation as key for sustained responses to these challenges. This was emphasized over and over again. We need to involve community groups. We need to involve civic groups that may not have had to do anything with fair housing per se into these conversations, and ensuring that these recommendations are looked at and studied and hopefully implemented in a full way. To quote a report from the National Housing Justice Advocates, significant policy changes and practices regarding fair housing require, quote, the centering the voices of people most affected by systemic barriers and inequities in housing, end of quote. And so that again is something I want to emphasize. We've got to figure out how to, raise public awareness, yes, but at all kinds of levels, lest all these good ideas may come to naught. I want to end with a proposal, which is not a new proposal, but a proposal that just for you to think about, but also how public awareness and enforcement of affirmatively furthering fair housing can actually generate some civic innovations. And here I'm referring to some work that I'm doing with ACE in Roxbury, and looking how environmental justice advocacy can utilize affirmatively furthering fair housing to expand organizing connections with advocacy groups involved with fair housing and fair lending and other social justice spaces. The constitutional home of environmental justice, in a sense, if I could say constitutional home, is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But how can Title VIII of the Fair Housing Act of 1968 and affirmatively furthering fair housing be approached as a tool to advance environmental justice? So that's one kind of civic innovation, which, by the way, is not new. And I think our earlier speaker, Daniel Webster, made reference to a very important development in Chicago, which I think incorporates this idea. But in another project, I'm also looking at how community land trusts can be tools for closing the racial wealth gap in Boston and other urban areas. How can community land trusts be used as a tool for advancing affirmatively furthering fair housing, especially in a context defined by a deep housing crisis and continuing concentration of wealth associated with lesser economic capacities for low-income or moderate-income groups to obtain and hold onto affordable and decent housing? So again, this simply suggests that fair housing is very comprehensive, it's very intersectoral, and once we appreciate how intersectoral it is, it becomes a very important tool in other areas where people are seeking to improve the quality of life along various dimensions. Let me stop there, and I think I'm supposed to turn it over to Candice. I hope I'm supposed to, because that's what I remember, but or at least let me get it back to Whitney. Sorry.
That's perfect. Thank you, Dr. Jennings. We are inviting up, as you mentioned, Candice and Kashana Hill from the Regis movement. Candice played an important role in this study as researcher and helping with the focus groups and the interviews. And I'm excited as well to join up the executive director, Kashana Hill from the Redress Movement, which we know came out of the book, The Color of Law, and this idea to bring folks together. And as we know in your report, those voices that uplifted that book, right, helped people to kind of understand what's happening, but now thinking about what the things are needed to really remedy and to redress. Full bios, as we mentioned, is available via the link, which my colleagues were throwing in the chat now. Excited for the conversation that you're moderating. Thanks, Katniss.
Thank you so much, Whitney. I'm now looking forward to moderating after Jamie. She did such an amazing job. What pressure there is on my shoulders now. But thank you so much for introducing this amazing group. And I have such an honor and privilege to be speaking to both of you right now. Before we begin with the questions, I would love for Kashana, if you would like to describe a little bit more about your work at Redress Movement, and then we will sort of go into the questions of the report that we made and our thoughts on that as well.
Sure thing, of course. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to be here with you all today. So as Whitney mentioned, the Redress Movement was founded as a response to the engagement and excitement around The Color of Law. When The Color of Law was published in 2017, the author, Richard Rothstein, spent time traveling around the country, right, talking to folks about the book and about this history of residential segregation. And one of the things that he was continually asked over and over is, well, what do we do next, right? What happens now? And as communities started to learn about the ways in which communities came to look the way that they do, and as people started to understand the history behind where and how we all live, then they were really interested in solutions, right, to the ongoing problem. And so Richard met with fair housing advocates and civil rights leaders and community members all across the country, and then developed a sort of planning committee who spent the next 3 or so years working to put together an organization. And the Redress Movement officially launched in 2022. So we've been around for only 2 years. I always have to emphasize that because I'm always asked, wow, when are you coming to our community? And then also, how come I didn't know anything about this if folks haven't heard about the Redress Movement yet? And so I want to assure everyone that you haven't missed anything. We just got here. And then also that we certainly will be expanding into other communities across the country. But once again, we've been around for 2 years. And so we are currently working in 3 communities across the country, which are Charlotte, North Carolina, Denver, Colorado, which is actually where I'm joining you all from today, and then Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We are also in the process of hiring an organizer and getting work started in Omaha, Nebraska as well. And so it should be pretty clear that our work is designed, right, to expand into a variety of communities across the country. And the work that we do is really focused on a few things. Firstly, community education. So sharing the information, right, around the federal government's role in seeding and then perpetuating residential segregation, of course, with the help of the real estate industry, making local communities aware of the ways in which their communities came to be segregated. And so we also, as part of our work, right, in addition to education, are producing original research and educational materials. Our research includes data analysis and also archival research. And then from that research, right, we create materials that are designed to educate communities about the segregation that they are experiencing. And we have a variety of resources available on our website, redressmovement.org. I'm not going to get into those specific resources because we need to keep the conversation going. And then we're also working to organize, right, and mobilize communities to take direct action in support of addressing and remediating residential segregation. And so I want to be very clear that the organizing and the mobilizing work that we we are doing, right, to build a base and to build this multiracial movement is critical to the ongoing success of the redress movement. In each of our 3 committees, we have created and recruited members for, we've created redress roundtables and recruited members for those roundtables. Our redress roundtables are the place where community members come together and share out stories about their histories and the histories of their neighborhoods. And then we all collectively work together to identify pressing needs in the community that the redress movement will address. And then we are also creating campaigns around how we can move forward to those goals that we would like to achieve. So that is a little bit about the work that we're currently doing in 3 communities across the country. And I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit more about things that communities can do on their own to address segregation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. You know, it's a really interesting idea, the idea of round tables, because I think we're all familiar with the thinking of it's not who you know, or sorry, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And so being able to pick people's brains and think about, you know, what are the issues that we're really looking at based on personal experience and also professional experience that folks, you know, who work in the field see every day. And so that's a big piece of what we did for the report, actually. So as a researcher, I spoke to people of many different backgrounds, people in working for municipalities, people who are organizers, researchers, and a lot of them had very similar responses to, you know, what issues are around fair housing. And James kind of alluded to that earlier, but the idea of, you know, the lack of funding, the lack of awareness of the law and how to really use it. And then also just like the disconnect between people doing the work and, you know, all of these departments working in silos. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts, Kashwana, and then I'll go to James for more of your thinking as well around your reactions to the report, and then maybe some remedies you can think of, you know, that come from your work.
So I think the report is absolutely outstanding, and I'm always so excited to have more attention drawn, right, to fair housing and the ways in which we can move forward to fulfill the promise of the Fair Housing Act. I think that what is important to note is that there is so much that we can do. I've spent about 20 years now as a civil rights and fair housing lawyer, and so have been, you know, litigating, right, the kinds of cases that are laid out in the report. And there's certainly a big need to continue that work. You will never hear me say that that's not the case, right? But we also have to continue to find ways to engage community, to bring people into the conversations and to build and mobilize the movement, right? And so that is the work of the redress movement that is pretty exciting, if I do say so myself. I think it's also important to be clear that there are a variety of policy options that can certainly have the effect of addressing right segregation, and many of them are spelled out in the report. I also want to point everyone to a new resource that the redress movement has published last week. We finalized and published a policy toolbox, and you can also find that on our website, that spells out 6 different community types and then provides some potential policies that can be useful to address residential segregation in those communities. There's also a very, very short, just 2 to 3 minute community survey found in the policy toolbox, and I would encourage everyone to take that survey, and it gives some information around the community that you live or work in, and then ties to policies that would address segregation in those communities. And then I also want to note, right, that in addition to policy change, there is still some very real accountability, right, and remedy that needs to be offered to communities. And so we're talking about money that needs to change hands in many respects. And so on that end and on that side of things, I would love to just reference the special purpose credit program that is being implemented in the state of Washington. And many of you may be familiar with this. There's been quite a bit of attention placed on this program over the last just couple of years, but the program comes out of a 2023 statewide law that is designed, right, to provide access to home ownership homeownership for people living in that state whose ancestors were denied access to homeownership prior to 1968, or who they themselves were living in the state and were denied access to homeownership prior to 1968. And so I'm sure that there will be a conversation, right, around the possibility of race-conscious remedies and programs, given the United States Supreme Court's affirmative action decision, because that question continues to come up. So I won't get too much into that. And I can speak more about that Washington program as we move forward. But I just wanted to share that framing, right, that there are really sort of two realms in which we can be thinking about redress. We can be thinking about policy change, right? And we can also, as a possibility model, be thinking about programs and dollars that will benefit, right, people who were denied the opportunity to access homeownership prior to 1968.
Absolutely. Thank you. James, please do add if you'd like to add.
Yes, yes. And by the way, Kashana, I did look into that policy tool a few weeks ago, and it's a fantastic tool. So I really, would encourage everyone to look at it. And I think very useful in coming up with not just broad strategies, but also local actions that people can take. In the in the report that we did, and Denise, knows this even more than I do, people reported observing abuses, fair housing abuses. For example, one person, as I recall, reported on how her work with Section 8 voucher holders indicated that Section 8 voucher holders basically did not know what their rights were. And this is in a state where we do a lot to inform Section 8 voucher holders and tenants and renters. So we have a long way to go. One of the things we tried to do in the report is to come up with a series of questions that people at a grassroots level, community level, can ask to hopefully generate some mobilization, some organizing and mobilization. And let me just read very quickly a summary of these questions, because they're a little bit more detailed than this. What explains the history and current low rates of Black and Latino home ownership in your town? How can zoning be used to enhance fair housing? How does zoning and public transportation limit multifamily housing, and how does it impact on various groups of people? Is the municipality leadership working actively with financial sectors to reduce discrimination and assist in increasing home ownerships? What is the extent and quality of outreach to people of color and low-income groups about housing opportunities? And how are immigrants and persons with limited English speaking ability approached in terms of raising awareness about fair housing regulations? And so the questions went along that line, but we thought it would be important, based on what we heard, to arm local groups concerned about the issues that we're talking about, how to begin thinking about this, how to begin mobilizing around this. And so we hope that will be very useful.
Very powerful. Thank you so much, James. Yeah, this whole conversation seems to be revolving around the words action and enforcement, and thinking about, we have these laws, we have these opportunities, we have folks working in this, but who's going to take the action and who's going to actually enforce all of this? And so the report really goes into also thinking about establishing a fair housing office. And so Governor Healey's Affordable Homes Act includes the creation of a state office of fair housing. If the office is created, what would your top priorities be to ensure that it has the greatest impact? And I'll start with James, because you're muted, and then we can go to Kashana.
Yeah. So again, I think maybe two things. One, we have to figure out how to again provide resources for community groups, for residents to take on and take charge of this conversation and this discussion, because as I quoted the piece on centering resident power, that's just critically important. And so what are the tools that can make that happen? How can advocacy organizations, I don't want to say take this more seriously, but take it more as their own, rather than operating in silos? How do we begin thinking about that beloved community that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about? And by the way, when the Fair Housing Act 1968 the predecessor was a housing act, let me say. In Chicago, Dr. King said, we finally began the first step in a 1,000-mile journey. So we have a long way to go. But I think triggering community involvement and getting nonprofits and social justice organizations to figure out how to work across these silos to really understand the comprehensiveness and the intersectoral nature of fair housing. Fair housing is not just discrimination. One of the things that we found, for example, was, and this is after looking at the websites, which you may remember, Katanice, it's shocking what government websites stated or did not state about fair housing in their cities and towns. It was either absent or minimized to, call the state's Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. And that was it. And so we have to figure out how to change that. And again, I think if we do that, it opens the door to perhaps some civic innovations. I'm calling them civic innovations that will be of great benefits to our communities.
Thank you, James.
So I'm gonna zoom in on something and then kind of zoom back out, right? I think that if we're, and I don't have any particular experience or knowledge about the, state Office of Fair Housing that is going to be created, because I don't live or work in Massachusetts. But what I would say that is critically important, right, when we think about agencies or departments like this, is just, it seems really basic, but it's not often very common. Making sure that the Fair Housing Office is focused on fair housing, and the person who understands and leads that office is someone who understands fair housing. And to be clear, what I'm talking about here is that often what happens is that we tend to conflate affordable housing and fair housing, right? And this can happen in a variety of different ways. I certainly know that sometimes people talk about affordable housing, even when they very well understand the difference between fair housing and affordable housing, because they don't want to scare folks, right? With the idea that like low income Black or brown tenants might be moving in next to them. And so then we start talking about how we need to build housing for educators and police officers. Well, certainly those folks need housing as well, right? But the idea of fair housing is not about just building housing, or it's not even about just housing that everybody can afford, right? When we're talking about fair housing, we're talking about access to opportunity and the ability to choose, right, one's neighborhood and housing situation without being limited by discriminatory housing policies and practices. Those are different things, right? And so I just want to be clear that if we're talking about an Office of Fair Housing being effective, then we have to be clear about those distinctions. We have to have someone who is willing to engage around the concept of fair housing and who understands what that definition means, right? And who isn't going to just be focused on affordable housing. And so I would also say approaching that work with an equity lens is critically important, right? And then I would also suggest that it's going to be important to take action on the things that this office has the ability to take action on, right? So you want to get out into the community. You want to check with, folks who are organizing or serving tenants. You want to check with the legal services attorneys, right? The legal aid organizations, the fair housing folks on the ground in Massachusetts. Get a sense of what the issues are that are perpetuating segregation. And I guarantee you that if you call anybody who does any of the work that I just mentioned, they can talk to you for an hour, right, about the policies that are keeping communities segregated. And so when you start to hear, well, NIMBYism, not in my backyard sentiment, in well-resourced white neighborhoods, right? And the inability to get housing that is affordable or that is available, right, to people like voucher holders or public housing residents, the inability to get housing like that built in those well-resourced, high opportunity communities. a statewide agency has the ability, right, to at least message that NIMBYism is not going to be tolerated for sure. And I would also say that you need to have someone in that role, leading that office, who is willing to bring in the law, right? As we know from the report, there's a federal Fair Housing Act that certainly governs all of this stuff, right? But there is longstanding precedent and case law around the ways in which elected officials, for instance, and municipalities can be liable for decisions that perpetuate segregation, right? And so being clear about what is actually possible to do and doing it. Is there a way to, or a need to, revamp how low-income housing tax credits are allocated in that state, right? Is there the opportunity to ensure that the Housing Finance Agency, for instance, that might have authority over development of affordable housing, are they using a screening policy that allows for folks who have arrests or convictions in their backgrounds to access those housing opportunities? There are just so many ways to ensure that this office is effective in living up to its promise, but it's really going to depend on having someone who understands what fair housing is and who is willing to tackle what they have the authority to tackle.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ashwana. And so we both acknowledge that, you know, housing discrimination is crucial, and acknowledging that is crucial, but more needs to happen. It doesn't just stop there. There needs to be action steps. There needs to be, you know, we're talking about, we know what's going on. We know the policies that are there. What do we do about it? And so what policies or practices do you think we should put in place to ensure that those, you know, not that knowledge that we all sort of share and talk amongst ourselves about, that they create a network that is equitable in the Commonwealth in the next 50, 60 years from now?
Well, let me first say that what Kashana stated is so important. I mean, it's not just affordable housing. It goes way beyond affordable housing, and I think that point continually has to be made and organized around. The other thing I would say is that it's not just us saying this, but there have been numerous judicial decisions in spite of that president, former president, whose name I won't mention, tried to dilute all of this. The Supreme Court has been clear for its decisions after decisions that this is about access to community assets. So I think that point has to be emphasized. One of the areas that I think we should look at, and some of this comes out of our work related to the assessment of fair housing in Boston, is how we define affordable. I think that's very important. And that may not be a policy issue as such, but we have some communities with such much lower levels of median household income that when we say affordable is 80% or even 90% of the area's median income established by HUD, that has to change. And I think it's changing in some ways at some levels, but that leaves a lot of people out. When we say things like, housing cost burden is 30%, severely housing cost burden is 50% of a household using their income on rental income, we also have to use a racial equity lens, because even though there are a lot of people who are housing cost burden, at least in Massachusetts, when you use a racial equity lens, you find that Black and Latinx people are especially on the economic bottom. So that also has to be addressed.
I think that's right. Oh, I'm sorry, please.
No, please. I was acknowledging Dean's.
I actually don't know that I have anything to add to that. I think
he left us all without words.
Yeah, I mean, I just hit the nail on the head, for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, James. I think that, you know, this conversation that we're having really brings up so many different issues that we see in the fair housing world. And, you know, as organizers, we've seen issues around how we calculate people's ability to afford rent or, you know, housing in general. And that's flawed. You know, 30% of someone making housing or making money for a rental apartment is not the same thing as someone who has a higher income, or the way we're calculating area median income, for example, is also can bring up issues. And so we're talking a lot about what do we see that's wrong, but what are some opportunities that we might, be leveraging, or that we could leverage for the growth of fair housing in the state? Oh, sorry, James, you're muted. Oh, I'm sorry, Kashwana, go ahead and.
Oh,
James.
no, please, Professor Jenny, go ahead.
You're making me think of, in terms of opportunities, of course, enforcement of fair housing is going to involve major resources. If we approach fair housing, not just as affordable housing, but certainly affordable housing as part of it, how do we think of this as an opportunity? Well, the other problem, or another problem we have in Massachusetts and in Boston, is that when you look at businesses owned by people of color, mostly Black and Latina businesses, and especially women in these groups, they get a very, very little piece of the possible contracts. So as dollars are released around, we're really going to push fair housing, and we're going to consider fair housing as intersectoral, the economic impacts of how we spend those dollars are also going to be very important. And this is another point we raised in our Boston's assessment of fair housing, which our Mayor Wu promulgated through an executive order about 2 years ago now. And so this is another issue that we raised. As we spend dollars, how do we use it under a fair housing umbrella to respond to other issues with a genesis of discrimination in housing in the first place?
So I'm actually going to go back to something that I mentioned earlier. And I'll share a little story. So prior to leading the redress movement, and I've been doing that for 7 months now, I was leading the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, which is a New Orleans-based fair housing advocacy group. And one of the things that we prioritized, right, was advocacy and engagement around the lack of access that people with arrests or convictions had to rental housing in New Orleans. Now, this is important as a fair housing issue in that community in particular, but also all across the country, because many of you may have heard this before, but Louisiana has a reputation. We've been fighting with Oklahoma, I believe, over the past couple of years for being the state that has the highest per capita rate of incarceration. And ground zero, right, for that highest per capita rate of incarceration is the city of New Orleans. And so New Orleans had the reputation of being the most incarcerated city in the most incarcerated state, in the most incarcerated country in the entire world, right? Because nobody locks up people like we do here in the United States. And so what we also knew was that in New Orleans, just about 60% of African-American men had an arrest in their background, right? And somewhere north of, I think about 40% of Black men in the community had a conviction, right, in their past. And so we were continuing to encounter screening policies that said that no person, right, who had any sort of arrest or conviction would be granted admittance into that housing opportunity, into that apartment complex. And there was also a major problem with the Housing Authority of New Orleans, right? Very, very, very punitive criminal screening procedures as well. Now, the Housing Authority was important to have them change their screening procedures because, as you all may know, New Orleans is a place with a very high percentage of people living in poverty. And at the time that we were working on this campaign, 25%, a full quarter of the renters in New Orleans were clients of the Housing Authority, right? So their incomes were so low that they were Housing Authority clients and they were either receiving vouchers or they were public housing residents, right? And so we've got a large housing provider in the city of New Orleans effectively making, right, their housing unavailable to a large swath of Black folks in the community. And so the damage was just very widespread from these very punitive policies. after HUD released their initial guidance in 2016, making it very clear, right, that these broad bans on anyone with arrests or convictions could violate the Fair Housing Act because they have a disparate impact based on race, then, we started working, right, with property owners across the city. And we were reaching out to folks and speaking with them about their screening procedures. But what we realized was that it was very, very, very difficult, right, to sort of get uniformity, particularly amongst the housing units owned by the housing authority. Now, some of you may have this experience in your communities as well, but the Housing Authority of New Orleans was only managing a very small percentage of the public housing units. And they have third-party property management companies all across the city that are managing public housing units. And each one of those property management companies had varying screening techniques, right? And so we went to them, we sent letters, we had conversations, maybe a lawsuit or two was threatened. But what actually worked for us, right, was working in partnership with groups led by formerly incarcerated people who decided to organize their folks. And so first, after a multi-year campaign, the city or the Housing Authority of New Orleans agreed to adopt screening procedures that were much more, right, progressive and permissive. And I won't get into a lot of detail, but there has been so much attention focused on the Housing Authority of New Orleans 2016 criminal screening procedure. And so if you haven't checked it out, I would encourage you to visit the Housing Authority of New Orleans website and look at that policy, which has really become a model for housing authorities across the country. So we first, right, we're working in coalition with folks organizing, and we won that fight. And then we decided to take the fight to the state finance agency, right? So we were showing up at their board meetings. We had community members prepared to tell their stories about how they were unable to access housing after being convicted, 10 years ago or 15 years ago or whatever the case was. And after those sustained efforts, we actually got the Louisiana Housing Corporation to adopt, right, screening procedures that communities signed off on. And these screening procedures that remove the broad bans have now opened up access for people with arrests and convictions because they now apply to all affordable housing units owned and managed by the Housing Corporation, as well as to all new affordable units that will come online. And so at the time, that was about 60,000 housing units that were opened up, right, to community members who had arrests or convictions in their background. And so the organizing, right, but being clear about where the change can be made is so critical, because if we were continuing to try and, file lawsuits or engage with those individual property management companies, we would still be fighting about which screening procedures would be in place. So I hope, right, that is helpful. It was a very long story, but I hope it was helpful in answering your question around where there are opportunities to organize and make change.
Absolutely. And, your story really brings up the importance of working in partnership, the importance of really targeting and knowing, the right steps to take. And I think this brings up the idea of we're working together to do what? There's equity, but there's also the thing above that, which is justice. And so you have to think about, these are all of the issues that we're facing as a community. And so as Leah Porter, the executive director of New Jersey, who's also affectionately known as the Fair Housing, or Mother of Fair Housing, she describes fair housing as fair living. And so everyone needs to live, right? We have the right to live. We have the right to breathe and eat and everything. But, housing is always the one thing that people always leave out when it comes to listing what it is that we need to survive and live with. And so if fair housing is about justice, what is needed to ensure that every one of our communities is a place of justice where we can thrive free of housing discrimination?
So I'll just say that, I feel this one is pretty simple, actually. So I will be super fast, which hasn't happened yet. But what we need, right, is we need to step away, right, from the idea of opportunity hoarding and ensuring, right, that those in positions of privilege and power will continue to have access to those positions of privilege and power, and that no one else will have access to, you know, those things. It is going to be important, right, to open up exclusionary communities, right? So we have to ensure that those communities become more open, right, and certainly integrated. And then the communities that were intentionally choked off and starved of investment by the federal government in conjunction with the real estate industry through things like redlining, we have to ensure, right, that those communities are able to experience opportunity. This has never been just about, certainly from my perspective, this has never been just about people of color moving into white neighborhoods. That firstly won't work. There's not enough space. And then secondly, there are plenty of folks like myself for whom they don't want that specific outcome, right? And so we have to be bringing opportunity to the communities that were faced with disinvestment. And we have to be doing that and bringing investment in a way that respects the folks who would like to remain in those communities. And we have to make sure they are protected and can stay put if they choose to do so.
Well, really, what I have to say to that is hallelujah. I'm serious, because I think I think as we have these discussions and we talk about opening up this, at least in the greater Boston area, suburban communities, which, by the way, under the force of demography, are beginning to change. There's still some problems, but there's still some cities and towns, let me say, places, let me say, that are very segregated. But demography is something that is beginning to shift that even a little bit. But if we approach this as if communities of color had no assets, had no resources, had no history, had no culture, had no religion, had no arts, we're part of the problem. So HUD has always been clear. HUD has always been clear upon using a balanced approach. Yes, we want access to community assets wherever, but that does not mean that we then not invest in increasing economic and educational opportunities where people who happen to be low income or working class live. In Boston, as some of us know, we have a danger of gentrification and displacement. Gentrification and displacement, in my opinion, is also a fair housing issue. So how at the local level do we prevent the displacement of people? Maybe that's tied to rent control. Maybe it's tied to people having rights before they're respecting the rights of renters before they're evicted, or preventing that at all. So it's not, it's a balanced approach where what you just stated has to also be part of the discussion. And I think, Denise, you might agree with me, but we also heard that point, that observation, loud and clear.
Absolutely. And I think we're coming up with our time. So I wanted to summarize all of the amazing things that you all have talked about. And so it seems that, you know, when we're talking about fair housing, we're really talking about several things that work together. And so awareness and scope is one of the important aspects of making sure that we are working with the laws that we have around fair housing, but also understanding how to use them effectively and, you know, work with in collaboration and partnership with others in our communities, you know, people who work in municipalities, organizers, residents, really getting everyone involved. And I think the idea that Krishana brought up earlier about roundtables is super important about, you know, I may not have the same experience as you do when it comes to housing and fair housing. And so how do we learn from each other? What are your experiences? What do you understand to see as a solution or an opportunity that I might not be seeing? And then the ideas of like, there are tools out there. So like, you know, zoning has definitely been used as a tool to create exclusionary zoning. So what is it that we can do, and what do we have available to us to try to start targeting these issues and start advocating for solutions for them? And then, you know, mobilizing and organizing behind these things. And then lastly is the idea of justice. So I think really making sure that all of us as human beings are able to live happily in our communities with access to healthy food and good transportation and stable housing. And so what are the things that we're doing to make sure that we're getting access to that and creating opportunities in our communities? So I am so privileged to have been able to speak with both of you, and I'm so honored to be in this space with you all. And I thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you all. It was an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I
Oh my
think Whitney
goodness.
is up.
Yes, thank you so much. I am lots of notes here, as you can probably see. Thank you all so much. What an excellent panel. Please join me in a virtual applause and all of your comments in the chat, and feedback has been amazing. I know we weren't able to get to some of the questions. We hope you engage with us further in the Fair Housing Committee, where we continue to do this work and have these conversations. The conversation definitely does not stop here. Thank you so much, Katniss, for moderating, Dr. Jennings, for your amazing report and presentation today, and Kashana for your continued work in the redress movement and in past work in New Orleans. Just really excited about the panel. Let's take a break. Let's take a break to refresh, to re-energize, to stretch and do whatever you need to do. Don't log off. Stay with us. We are excited to be able to give our awards to our awardees who have been doing this amazing work, who we want to acknowledge. And I know you guys may have been thinking about other folks who you might want to uplift. We do have a survey at the end of today's session, because we want to hear from you about whom other are folks who we should be acknowledging and awarding on next year. So let's take a few minutes. Let's come back together at 3:30. We will have our awards presentation, and then we'll be wrapping up. I'm excited to hear from each of our awardees. We will again put the link in the chat so you can read up on their bios, and excited to have you join us back. 3:30 sharp.
All right, everyone, welcome back. Hopefully you were able to grab a drink, quick snack as we move forward with the next portion of our event today. So I will pass it to my colleague Lily Link so we can move to this next portion of presenting some great awards to some amazing people. Lily?
Thank you, Monica. I have the honor of presenting our first 2024 CHAPA Fair Housing Award to Dr. Tiffany Manuel, founder and CEO of The Case Made. Dr. T brings her years of experience as a social scientist to support thousands of changemakers across the country, including our staff here at CHAPA. Dr. T really revolutionized the way that we talk about our work and about housing more broadly, and she continues to be a source of inspiration, wisdom, and guidance for us. So let's give a round of applause to Dr. T in recognition of her commitment to making the case to affirmatively further fair housing. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lily, and thank you all for the few folks who are able to stay on the call for just a little while and say hello. I want to take a moment. This is beautiful. I didn't expect that to come in the mail, but thank you so much for this very lovely award. And I just want to say, you know, I spent a number of years in Massachusetts finishing my PhD and just living, and I can tell you all the sort of housing challenges I faced when I was there I'm just so gratified to see an amazing housing community doing so much work, really. I mean, just heads and tails above, I think, for the time that I lived there. And I've been blessed, even after having moved away, to have continued, you know, working with an amazing group of change makers all over the state to do some really important work. I'd say over the last 5 years, I've been just gratified to see you all continue to raise the bar, to ask questions, then to ask better questions, to give answers, to get better answers, to push forward, to be strategic in how we get around opposition and obstacles. And I'm proud to have been just a small part of your successes. I loved hearing the speakers today. I just think that all of them sort of raised the bar in terms of helping us to think about the moment that we are in, both all the wonderful opportunities of connecting to residents and really hearing from folks what they need, right, to move forward, as well as just thinking about the new legal challenges and some of the other challenges of AI and all the things, right, that are going to require us to be super strategic about what comes next. And I always say, you know, we got to be strategic in one sense. We have to be thoughtful. We have to win in the courts that in a way that is increasingly challenging, but we also then have to win in the court of public opinion. And that's the work that I've really had the pleasure of working with so many of you on, and being able to contribute to your work. So I will not drone on. You all hear me enough talking on and on and on and on. I just want to remind folks, you know, as I close out instead of my thank you to you all, that you know, this is a challenging moment for us as housers, and I think as folks who do deep community development work. And that it is our opportunity and obligation, I think, to not let the heaviness of the moment sort of weigh on folks, right? We talked a lot about gentrification and segregation and displacement and opportunity hoarding. It's a lot, it's heavy conversation. So I just want to remind folks, right, in the way that we talk about the work and do the work, to take the joy of what it means to be in collaboration with our community partners, our residents, right, our neighbors, to take the joy of that into all the work that we are poised to do. Once again, thank you so much, CHAPA. Y'all have been a wonderful partner, as well as many others across the state. And I just look forward to doing another, right, decade or so of work together to move Massachusetts forward. Thank you so much, everybody. Much appreciated.
Another round of applause for Dr. T. Thanks so much for being here with us. It's always wonderful to see you virtually or in person. Our next awardee is former Newton City Councilor and longtime housing advocate, Deb Crossley. In her 14 years on the Newton City Council, Deb worked tirelessly to make Newton a place where everyone could thrive, including her 4 years on the Zoning and Planning Committee, where she led the charge in implementing the MBTA Communities Act, which resulted in new multifamily zoning that will encourage the development of walkable, equitable neighborhoods around their village centers. So in recognition of your commitment to affirmatively furthering fair housing in Newton and beyond, we present this 2024 CHAPA Fair Housing Award to Deb Crossley.
Well, thank you so much. I am honored and humbled to be in the presence of the extraordinary people who make up your organization. And I'm humbled by your recognition, really, because mine is my work, and I imagine I'm only here because of somebody within your organization, and I have to say I recognize very few names in the list. Noticed the work that was going on in the MBTA communities, and especially the first 12 who were supposed to have their plans in by the end of the year. I just want to say, you know, the role I've played is small, but I'm happy to play it. It feels important, but I look at this room full of remarkable people, you devote all of your professional and many of your personal lives to whether it's creating housing or servicing housing or educating and advocating within your communities to support more housing. You all realize that safe and decent housing that's affordable to a wide spectrum of persons is critical to a happy and healthy community. I was chatting with someone on the list here earlier and thinking, listening to the earlier speakers, it almost seems like half of Massachusetts should be brought to court right now for a century of violating the affirmatively fair housing requirements, right? Because what zoning is the guy earlier who was talking about insurance companies, and that insurance is a discriminatory practice. That's fundamentally what it is, right? Well, zoning is fundamentally restrictions on your ability to do what you want to do on your land. And for the first time in the city of Newton since 1920, in 100 years, we reversed what had been an increasingly restrictive covenant by opening the doors to allowing, for the first time since 1987, when it was disallowed, multifamily housing by right, and more development in our struggling village centers. So I think I want to just make 2 points, and I think your earlier speakers and all of you know this, and you talk about it in different ways. But for me, and I come to this as also an architect with a private practice, and my schooling in the 1970s was about architecture as a social art. Fundamentally, people need shelter. Human beings don't live outside or should not be living outside and exposed to the elements, right? But in architecture, we're generalists on a number of subjects. And the important thing is to understand the relationship among all things. And when you're given a project, you're not only just serving the program of the project. It matters where it is, how you build it, all those other things. So what I want to say, the first point is it's not just about housing. For me, it's not just about housing. And the second point has to do with educating and advocating across interest groups in order to achieve the housing, but for the multiple purposes that housing serves. Yeah, it's fundamental, but it's also fundamental to a strong local economy. If you don't have housing in the right places, you can't, and you don't have enough commercial assets in the right places, you're not providing housing for the staff you need in your workplace. You're not providing customers in your shops. And it's critical to economic diversity, which we have very little of in the city of Newton. And therefore, social diversity, which it makes your community stronger. And how we build it and where we build it is critical to a sustainable environment. So why is that important? Because we only got where we got in Newton, even though we got half of the map we wanted. We got the whole ordinance. We passed the whole ordinance intact. Can we expand the map over time? I hope so, but obviously we also lost the election to the very conservative folks who would have much less housing. But we brought together all of the housing advocacy groups, our boards and commissions, but also all of the environmental groups. The citizens group organized around environmental issues have now come to understand and advocate for housing as critical to sustainable communities. And our chamber and our Economic Development Commission, we invited them all in to be critical of our work, to be constructively critical of the work. And they all came in at the end, all of them, every single one, supporting our work. Obviously, that wasn't enough. to overcome a very, even though it was a minority in terms of numbers, a very strong and well-organized opposition leading up to the election. But it was enough to change the conversation in the city of Newton from no way, no how to, okay, but how much? How much do we do now? So now those groups, and I want to name a few of them, well, I should say during our lobbying effort, many of those groups, particularly the community groups, the citizens groups, joined together and created this group called Newton for Everyone. And Newton for Everyone became visible. It was at that time a coalition. They came to our meetings, they held up signs, so at least we had an equal number of signs, you know, as we were going through the city council. We had a couple of environmental groups, Green Newton, 350.org, Engine 6 Housing Advocates, the Fair Housing Group, the Economic Development Commission, as I said, in the Chamber, the Interfaith Clergy on Housing Equity. The citizens groups joined together and became Newton for Everyone. And Newton for Everyone has just relaunched itself with a slightly broader mission. And if anyone here is from Newton, who I might not know, I hope you will go to the Newton for Everyone website. We launched a first newsletter last week. I'll read you the mission statement. Dedicated to promoting housing opportunities for people of all ages, means, backgrounds, and abilities in Newton. The housing shortage affects us all. We believe that diverse housing options are crucial to fostering a thriving community, a sustainable environment, and a robust economy. We strive to actively shape and influence the political discourse on city policies to address today's pressing community needs and build for the future. So we have an event coming up, and we're going to be at the city fairs. We have a website, and we're taking the long view and seeing if we can expand that map. So thank you very much for putting me in your show today, and for the lovely award you sent to my home. Thank you, and more power to you. So impressed with your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. Thank you for your impactful work, and congratulations to all the awardees. It is my pleasure to present this next award to Madi Toure. He is the president and CEO of Massachusetts Housing and Investment Corporation, MHIC, with the CHAPA 2024 Fair Housing Award for his impact and continued investment in communities that are often disinvested. Ensuring minority businesses benefit from financing, collaborating with sponsors to hire a diverse workforce, and constantly uplifting the duty to affirmatively further fair housing, and challenging us to foster inclusivity into urban planning and design. He is my favorite co-panelist because then I get to just say what he said, because they bring me on to talk about fair housing. And he is constantly uplifting the word and the term and all of the great work that is necessary to affirmatively further fair housing. It seems a trend that many of our awardees often are at the same time are announced as Boston Magazine's most influential Bostonians. And we know that Madi was most recently identified as one of those persons. So congratulations for that. And for your commitment, as you said, to make Boston a more affordable, prosperous, fun, and equitable city. We want to acknowledge you for your great work and commitment to the greater Boston area, and with the award for your commitment to, again, affirmatively further fair housing and investing in communities that are often disinvested to ensure every community is a community that can thrive. So it is my pleasure to hand over the mic to you and to present you with this award. Thanks, Madi.
Thank you so much. And yes, you are my favorite panelist. We have fun. So I think we did like 2 last year, which is great. So thank you so much for the introduction and for the award. Thank you to CHAPA. It's just an amazing organization, and I love the partnership that we've had over the years. I've always said with Rachel, like you guys oversee all the community in our ecosystem, and then you also call us individually if there's a topic or something that's happening in our ecosystem, which is actually amazing that that happens because you've got so many constituents. I so appreciate that. I want to say thank you to our staff at MHIC, just the amazing men and women that work every day to make sure that we are really showing up to the people that we serve, the communities that we serve. They work tirelessly to do that. I want to say thank you too to our board who give both their time. Lord knows they give a lot of their time, and just want to say thank you to them. They're just amazing. I'd like to I think the things that I want to touch on is just about that Massachusetts has a housing problem. I know we're like one of the largest affordable housing financiers in Massachusetts. I think we're the largest LIHTC nonprofit financier of affordable housing. But it seems to me that we've got a problem with not just affordable housing, but we've got a problem with workforce housing. We've got a problem with market rate housing. And so what we've been focusing on at MHIC over our life, quite frankly, and really hyper-focused on is just about community building and around how do we actually say to people, it's not just not in my backyard doesn't just mean affordable housing. It means your son or daughter or grandbaby can't live next to you anymore in the state of Massachusetts. And those are the larger problems that we have to solve. And I want to see us do that in a way that makes it such that not just affordable housing is production comes into play, but also communities come into play. There's a strain that I see that worries me from the affordable housing side of things, where we've got such a big problem and we're looking for space and four walls and a roof to house people, when we have to think about the people after we give them their keys. What does their daily life look like afterwards? And that's some of the stuff that we're really trying to focus on in a real and meaningful way, working with CHAPA, working with all of our partners, our investors, trying to figure out how to do that, how to build community. Instead of saying, how do we get more affordable housing? It's like, how do we build more communities? And that means it's got to have market rate housing in it, it's got to have workforce housing in it, and it's got to have affordable housing in it. It has to have proximity to grocery stores and healthy grocery stores and dry cleaners and outlets for hospitals, et cetera, and daycares and educational centers. And just, I also like to say this too, be in the middle of cities as well. Because I think a lot of times we're pushing a lot of our affordable housing outside of city centers, when that's a critical thing that we need to start looking at, because the single mother that has to take their child to school 30 minutes from their house and then go to the grocery store and then go to work and then do all of this, and they're not able to spend that important time with their child, that's a problem. So being able to work in proximity to where you live, in proximity to where you work, is something that we're also focusing on. And so I always like to say that I want to build affordable housing in places that are not affordable as well. And that's something that we are focused on. Lastly, I just want to touch on one of the things that's incredible that'll be launching soon, is the work that Mass Housing has done around the Equitable Developer Fund. The work, I don't know that we can overstate what they have done. It is literally the largest publicly funded fund of its kind in the country, $50 million for developers that are economically and socially disadvantaged, and to invest in their companies, not just their projects. And they're doing that because, and thankfully in partnership with us now, because the people in the communities, that they see the opportunities first. They see the abandoned building. They see the fact that they don't have a coffee shop in their neighborhood. They see the fact that they don't have services that only happen when some big development is coming to their neighborhood. And then all of a sudden they're asking, why now? Is this for me? And I think that this fund, in a real and meaningful way, helps to start to say, to empower, to give agency to developers that are economically and socially disadvantaged, to say, we see you, we are here to help fund you, to give you the power to actually invest in your community at every level, whether you want to do a single family home or you have the capacity to try and do a 100-unit building. And I think that that is super important. And I just wanted to highlight that partnership, because I think what they've done and what the state has done, what the governor has done, if you will, is just tremendous. So thank you again. I so appreciate this community. The ecosystem in Massachusetts around affordable and fair housing is just extraordinary. And thank you again, CHAPA, for all the good work that you do.
No, thank you, and appreciate your remarks here. Just so excited about really being able to take this opportunity to acknowledge folks who are doing such great work. Like AIM in Milton, many of us have been focused on Milton for a number of reasons more recently, but we are excited to acknowledge Affordable Inclusive Milton. They are a group of private residents who came together in Milton, concerned with the historical long-term stance of the town and really wanting to put inclusivity and making sure that there's affordability and that Milton is a welcoming place to live. I have had the pleasure within our Municipal Engagement Initiative program to work with them really very closely through our program and providing technical assistance and getting to know them through the work. They work closely with the redress movement and some of the work that they have been doing in piloting their program. We just really want to applaud the great work that you all have done. The bios are in the link provided. But as you know, they put together MBTA communities forums and were pivotal and instrumental in having their representative town meeting vote overwhelmingly to pass the zoning articles in compliance back in December. And then despite the town sort of rescinding, they continue to work in political venues to ensure affordable housing for all. So I want to please join me in congratulating the Affordable Inclusive Milton group and Robert Rafosky, who will be accepting the award on behalf of those great folks. I want to just name some of them: Jeffrey Wilkinson, Tom Callahan, Julie Creamer, Robert Lavash, Carolyn Cahill. It's been a pleasure to work alongside you, and we want to applaud you all for the great work that you all are doing, specifically in communities that have been historically exclusionary. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you, Whitney. Like the other awardees, we got one of these beautiful things too. Thank you so much. Just to add a little bit to what Whitney was saying, we really began in 2021 as just a series of private discussions among a few Milton citizens concerned with the historical long-term stance of the town, which made the building of affordable housing a great difficulty. Like many suburban communities throughout the nation, Milton has used its zoning to be an exclusionary community. In April 22, we went public with a website and solicitation of residents to join us in advocating for more affordable housing and inclusivity of our town's population. We held the first public forum, as Whitney mentioned, on the MBTA Communities Act in December 22. We were lucky to have CHAPA offer one of our speakers at the forum. We followed up the forum with continued publicity about the act and the need for more housing in town throughout 2023. And we were so excited to have our representative town meeting pass zoning articles in compliance with the act in December 2023. However, as you know, the story continued. If you've been following the news, consistent with a provision in our town charter, a citizen petition successfully put the zoning articles to a town-wide vote. Despite the town as a whole voting to subsequently rescind town meeting approval of the MBTA zoning, AIM will continue to advocate for affordable housing in other political venues in town. We'll be monitoring the legal ramifications of the Attorney General's lawsuit against the town, and we'll also be continuing to identify where we can be successful in increasing housing affordability and making Milton a welcoming community for everybody. As all of you know, this will be a long struggle, but it's certainly one worth waging. So on behalf of AIM, I thank CHAPA for this award, and we're looking forward to working with you and other organizations and individuals throughout the state to promote housing affordability and community inclusivity. Thank you for putting our website URL in the chat, and thanks again.
You're muted, Rachel.
Okay. Perfect. Oh, muted again.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Excellent. I'm so sorry. I'm in a spot where I can't really speak, but I'm going to anyway. One, thank you so much for joining us today. I truly hope you are feeling inspired, you're feeling empowered and fueled to make change in your community and across the Commonwealth. Please check out CHAPA's website and sign up for a Fair Housing Committee. This is a place where you can connect with advocates on a regular basis and practitioners all across Massachusetts as we work together to end discrimination and affirmatively further fair housing so that everyone can have a safe, healthy, affordable home in the community they choose. I also want to thank my dream team of colleagues at CHAPA. You all are just amazing leaders, and you could hear it in everybody's comments today. In particular, I want to thank CHAPA's Director of Fair Housing and Municipal Engagement, Whitney Demetrius, truly remarkable, and our whole municipal engagement team, Sade Ratliff, Monica Keel, and Lily Lank. Thank you all for everything you do every single day to further fair housing, expand opportunities. You're just amazing. I also want to thank our amazing panelists today. We just had a wealth of knowledge between Dr. Michael Akinwumi, John Michael Fana, Jamie Williamson, Dr. James Jennings, Bob Terrell, Kashana Hill. Your leadership, your excellent presentations. We are so fortunate to be joined by you today. And thank you to our honorees. I am just honored to be working alongside each of you, Dr. Tiffany Manuel, Deb Crossley, Madi Trey, and Affordable Inclusive Milton. The work that you do every day for housing justice and for people who are left out and kept out is so important. And on those hard days, just thank you for that you keep going and you keep doing the work and you're making a difference and your work is so inspiring. We're grateful for your leadership. Thank you also to our financial supporters who make it possible for our dream team to be able to do this work that we do. And you can be one of those financial supporters. Please donate to CHAPA. You can do it on our website. Our individual supporters are so vital to our work, whether it's the financial contribution you can make or the time that you give. We are grateful to you. And if you like seeing everyone virtually at today's symposium, you can see us in person. We have a couple of forums coming up and our big annual celebration on June 5th at the Boston Convention Center. You can sign up for it. I'm sure someone's going to put the link in because my team is remarkable at putting the links in right away. Sign up. We would love to see you there. It truly is an amazing event bringing together over 1,000 people from the affordable housing community in a really celebratory way because celebrating our accomplishments is key to continuing this work. And in addition to celebrating, I want to let you all know that our table is about to get a lot bigger. CHAPA is launching Affordable Massachusetts, a cross-sector campaign that will change the conversation around housing at the state level and bringing more people into the work at the local level. Together, we are going to make the case and put policies in place for the homes that people, our communities, and the Commonwealth need to thrive. So stay tuned for more information. And thank you all, everyone who's here today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for everything that you do every day to make this world a better place. I hope you have a great day. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Till next year.
Bye, everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you. This was great.
Claudio, I just wanted to double check with you before I log off. Is there anything that you need from us to close out your Zoom?
I think we're all set.
All right. Hi,